An entire race of gods vanished, driven from the surface of the world, forced to retreat into the hollow hills and shadowy realms beneath our feet. They were the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, a tribe of beings who wielded magic like a science and ruled Ireland with power and light. They were masters of art, poetry, and warfare. Yet they fell. Their golden age ended not with a bang, but with a slow, tragic fade into myth and folklore. And at the center of this catastrophic decline stands one figure, their king, their protector, their most powerful champion, a god so mighty, so skilled in every art, that he was known by a simple, profound title, the Dagda, the good god. He was the All-Father, the Lord of great knowledge, who possessed a club that could slay 9 men in a single blow, and with its other end restore them to life. He owned a harp that could command the emotions of any army, and a cauldron that could feed the world without ever running empty. He was the bedrock of his people, their shield and their provider. So here is the question that haunts the very heart of Irish mythology. If the Dagda was so powerful, so good at everything, why did he let his people fall? What was the one catastrophic mistake made by this divine father figure that sealed his children's fate and condemned them to an eternity in the twilight underground? The answer is a story of power, sacrifice, and a humiliation so profound it would echo through the ages. And it begins not with a king on a throne, but with a figure who often seemed more like a fool than a god. To understand the Dagda, you first have to understand his people. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not gods in the way we might think of the Greek Olympians, lounging on a mountaintop. They were a tangible physical race who arrived in Ireland from 4 mythical northern cities, bringing with them a level of knowledge and magical prowess that the world had never seen. They were architects, poets, druids, and warriors. When they descended upon the shores of Ireland, they came in dark clouds, cloaking the sun for 3 days and 3 nights, an arrival so terrifying and mysterious it was clear the old ways were over. They were a force of order, civilization, and light, but they had to fight for their new home against the brutal, chaotic forces that already dwelled there. And leading them, though not always as their king, was the Dagda. His name itself is a title, and Dagda. It's often translated as the good god, but this is where modern ears can get it wrong. Good, in this ancient context, doesn't mean morally righteous or kind. It means good at everything. He was the master of all trades, the divine polymath. If you needed a warrior, he was the best. A builder, a strategist, a musician, a magician, he excelled at all of it. His other names reveal his true stature: Eachad Alathair, the All-Father, and Ruad Rofessa, the Red Man of great knowledge. He was the patriarch, the ultimate source of wisdom and strength for his entire tribe. And his power wasn't just an abstract concept. It was made real through 3 legendary treasures, 3 objects of immense power that defined his very essence. First was his cauldron, the Cuar Ansiask, known as the Undryable. This was no ordinary pot. It was a vessel of infinite abundance. No matter how many people came to it, no matter how great their hunger, the cauldron could provide a feast for them all. It was said that no company ever left it unsatisfied. This wasn't just about food. It was a symbol of the Dagda's core identity. He was the provider, the god of abundance and hospitality. In a world where famine and scarcity were constant threats, a god who could guarantee you would never go hungry was a god you worshipped without question. He was the ultimate host, the divine chieftain whose hall was always open and whose generosity was literally endless. Second was his harp, a magnificent instrument of oak named Tuatha. But this was no mere tool for entertainment. The Dagda's harp was an instrument of cosmic control. It was a weapon that fought not with blades but with sound. When he played it, he could produce 3 magical strains that could bend reality to his will. The first was the Galtry, the strain of sorrow, which could make entire armies weep uncontrollably, their spirits broken, their will to fight completely dissolved in a wave of unbearable grief. The second was the Giantry, the strain of joy, which could fill hearts with such irresistible laughter and merriment that all anger and fear were forgotten. And the third, and perhaps most powerful, was the Suantry, the strain of sleep. With these notes he could put anyone, from a single man to a countless host, into a deep, unshakable slumber. His harp wasn't just a musical instrument. It was a tool for manipulating the very emotions that drive mortals and gods alike. It could bring order to chaos, and put the seasons themselves into their correct order. And finally there was his club, the Lorg Mór, or the Great Staff. This was the raw, untamed power of the Dagda made manifest. It was a massive, fearsome weapon, so heavy it had to be dragged on wheels, leaving a furrow in the earth like a boundary ditch. This club embodied his duality, his role as both a creator and a destroyer. One end, the rough end, was an instrument of absolute destruction. With a single touch, it could kill 9 men, their lives extinguished in an instant. It was the fury of the storm, the crushing power of the earth. But the other end, the smooth end, held the complete opposite power. With a gentle touch, it could restore the dead to life, mending bone and flesh, breathing warmth back into cold bodies. Life and death, creation and destruction, all held in his hands, balanced in a single weapon. A cauldron of endless plenty, a harp that commands the soul, and a club that masters life and death. With these treasures, the Dagda was more than a king. He was a force of nature. He was the pillar holding up the world of the Tuatha Dé Danann. So why, then, is he so often described not as a shining armored king, but as something almost comical? The texts paint a picture of a crude, almost brutish figure. A pot-bellied man wearing a short, brown tunic that was always too small, barely covering his backside. A lumbering giant who drags his massive club behind him, his appetite as colossal as his frame. This isn't the image of a divine sovereign like Zeus or Odin. It's the image of an earth giant, a figure of raw rustic power. And that is the entire point. The Dagda wasn't a sky god, detached and ethereal. He was a god of the earth. His potbelly wasn't a sign of sloth. It was a symbol of his abundance, like his ever-full cauldron. His crude tunic and simple appearance weren't a sign of foolishness. They were a sign of his connection to the land, to the common folk, to the raw, untamed magic of the world itself. He was fertility, agriculture, and strength all rolled into one. He represented the very life force of Ireland. His appearance was not a weakness, it was a statement. He had no need for golden armor or a stately throne, because his power was inherent, primal, and absolute. We have now seen the god, the provider, the master of all arts, the wielder of life and death, a being whose power seems limitless, whose devotion to his people is unquestionable. Which brings us back with even more urgency to that dark and terrible question. How does a god like this fail? How does a father with this much strength watch his children's kingdom crumble? The answer lies not in a grand epic battle, but in a moment of utter humiliation. It lies with his greatest enemy, a dark and twisted race of beings who were the polar opposite of his people. They were the Fomorians, and their arrival would force the Dagda into a confrontation that would not only test his power, but his dignity. And it is in the story of his encounter with them that we find the first thread of the terrible mistake that would unravel everything. The Fomorians were a force of nature as much as they were a people. A race of sea giants often depicted as grotesque and monstrous, with the eye of a goat or the head of a bull. They were the original rulers of Ireland, the embodiment of the chaos and brutal, untamed wilderness that existed before the coming of the gods. And now they were back. They had returned to reclaim their ancient home, imposing crippling taxes on the Tuatha Dé Danann, demanding a share of their milk, their grain, and even their children. They were a shadow stretching over the land, and the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, the final war for the soul of Ireland, was inevitable. In the tense days leading up to the war, the Tuatha Dé Danann needed intelligence. They needed a spy, someone brave enough and perhaps foolish enough to walk directly into the enemy camp. And who better than the Dagda? He was not just a warrior, he was a chieftain, a diplomat. His mission was to delay the battle, to buy his people more time to prepare. So, under the guise of an ambassador, he journeyed to the Fomorian encampment. The Fomorians, however, were not fools. They knew who he was. They knew of his reputation as the Eachad Alathair, the Great Father, but they also knew of his other, less flattering reputation, his prodigious appetite. They saw his massive frame, his simple tunic, and they decided to have some fun. They would mock this so-called good god. They would turn his own nature against him in a spectacle of humiliation. Their plan was simple, yet diabolically grand. They ordered a pit to be dug, the size of a small house, and into it they poured 80 gallons of milk, 80 gallons of meal, and an equal amount of fat. Then they began to empty their larders. Whole carcasses of goats, sheep, and swine were tossed in, boiled together until they formed a monstrous bubbling porridge. It was a feast of contempt, a meal designed not to honor a guest but to break him. When the Dagda arrived, they led him to the pit. The stench alone was an assault. The bubbling gray mass was a mockery of everything a feast should be. The Fomorian champions, in deck the king and his generals, gathered around, their laughter a low, rumbling thunder. They presented him with the terms. This meal had been prepared for him, their honored guest. To refuse it would be the gravest of insults, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality. If he refused, they would kill him where he stood. But if he ate every last drop, they would spare his life. It was a perfect trap. A test of dignity disguised as a test of appetite. They expected him to fail, to balk at the sheer disgusting volume of it all, and give them the excuse they needed to strike him down. Or, if by some miracle he tried, they would watch in amusement as he sickened and choked on their slop. Either way, the great Dagda would be humbled. The Dagda looked at the pit. He looked at the sneering Fomorian faces, and he looked at the ladle they had prepared for him. It was a weapon in itself, a massive wooden spoon so large, the myths say, that a man and a woman could lie together in its bowl. He knew what they were doing. He understood the insult. But the Dagda was not just a god of brute strength. He was a god of abundance, of life in all its messy, hungry, glorious forms. And he would not be shamed by the very thing he represented. He picked up the giant ladle. The Fomorians fell silent, their smirks frozen on their faces. The first scoop was a struggle. He plunged the ladle deep into the thick, lumpy stew, and brought it to his lips. He ate. Then he took another scoop. And another. He ate with a methodical, relentless rhythm. He was not just eating, he was consuming their scorn. With every mouthful, he was swallowing their mockery and turning it into his own strength. The Fomorians' laughter died in their throats. Their amusement turned to disbelief, and then to a creeping primal fear. This was not a man. This was a force. The pit, which had seemed impossibly vast just moments before, began to shrink. The level of the porridge dropped foot by foot. The Dagda's stomach, covered by his simple tunic, began to swell. It grew to the size of a boulder, a small hill, becoming so distended and round that the Fomorians joked he would need a wagon to carry it away. But he did not stop. He scraped the bottom of the pit, his massive ladle digging into the earth itself. He ate the last of the meat, the last of the grain, and then he began to eat the gravel and the dirt at the bottom just to prove a point. He had not just accepted their challenge, he had annihilated it. When he was finished, he stood up, his belly so taut and full it was a wonder he could move at all. He had done it. He had eaten the entire thing. He had turned their weapon of humiliation into a demonstration of his divine power. He had shown them that what they considered an obscene, impossible amount, he considered a simple meal. The Fomorian kings and champions were stunned into silence. Their plan had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. They had to honor their word. His life was spared. But the Dagda's mission was not over. As he staggered away from the porridge pit, bloated and barely able to walk, he encountered the daughter of the Fomorian king, a beautiful sea goddess. In some versions of the tale, she mocks his appearance, his comically swollen belly. But the Dagda, even in this state, was a charmer. He was the god of abundance in all its forms, after all. What followed was not a battle of swords, but a battle of wits and wills. He seduced her, and in their union, he secured more than just a moment of pleasure. He secured a promise. She swore an oath to him that she would use her magic, her Draocht, to help the Tuatha Dé Danann. She would work from within the Fomorian camp, undermining their efforts, enchanting their druids, and weakening their will to fight. The Dagda had walked into the heart of the enemy's power, faced down their ultimate test of humiliation, and walked away not only with his life, but with a powerful new ally. He had turned their greatest strength, their brutish power and scorn, into a weakness. He had proven that the good god was not just good but cunning, not just powerful but strategic. The Fomorians had meant to show him as a gluttonous fool, but he had revealed himself as a living embodiment of the land itself, capable of consuming any challenge, digesting any insult, and turning it into strength. It was a staggering victory of diplomacy and sheer divine will. The stage was now set for the great battle. With the Fomorians' morale shaken and a saboteur in their midst, the Tuatha Dé Danann's chances had never looked better. The Dagda had played his part perfectly. But in the complex tapestry of fate, every thread pulled has an unintended consequence. And as he left the enemy camp, his mind on the coming war and his new alliance, he could not possibly have known that the greatest threat to his people, and to his own heart, was not the army he was about to face. It was a promise he had yet to make, and a child he was destined to lose. The promise was made not on a battlefield, but in secret, in the shadowed groves that lined the banks of a sacred river. The woman was Bone, goddess of the river Boyne, a being of immense power and beauty in her own right. And she was married, not just to anyone but to Elkmer, a formidable judge and chieftain among the Tuatha Dé, a man whose knowledge of the law was matched only by his jealousy. For the Dagda, the All-Father, the protector of his people, to pursue the wife of such a man was an act of catastrophic recklessness. It was a betrayal not just of a kinsman, but of the very order he was meant to uphold. So why? Why would a king on the very eve of war risk everything for a forbidden love? Perhaps it wasn't just love. Perhaps it was strategy. Elkmer was a powerful but difficult ally. Securing Bone's loyalty, and through her, the power of the river itself, might have been a calculated move. Or perhaps, in the crushing weight of his duties, with the fate of a nation on his shoulders, the Dagda simply sought a moment of solace, a human connection that reminded him of what he was fighting for. The ancient texts don't give us a clear motive. They only give us the consequences. And the consequences were immediate and absolute. Bone became pregnant. And in that moment, the affair transformed from a dangerous secret into a ticking clock, a 9-month countdown to utter ruin. If Elkmer discovered the truth, he would not just seek vengeance on the Dagda and Bone. He would demand the child's life. The political fallout would shatter the unity of the Tuatha Dé Danann just when they needed it most. The Fomorians would descend upon a fractured, feuding people and wipe them from the face of Ireland. Everything the Dagda had built, everything he was preparing to defend, would be consumed by the fire of his own making. He was trapped. A king with the power to level mountains and command the seasons was rendered helpless by the most natural process in the world. But the Dagda was not just a king. He was a master of magic, a druid of unparalleled skill. And he concocted a plan so audacious, so reality-bending, it remains one of the most stunning feats in all of Irish myth. He couldn't stop time. He couldn't reverse it. So he decided to stretch it. His target was Elkmer. Using his immense power, the Dagda sent Elkmer on a journey. It was a simple errand, a short trip that should have taken no more than a day. But as Elkmer set out, the Dagda worked his greatest magic. He took command of the sun itself. He reached into the heavens and halted its journey across the sky, fixing it in place at its zenith. For the traveler Elkmer, the day simply didn't end. The sun hung high and bright, never dipping towards the horizon. To him it felt like one long continuous morning. He completed his tasks, made his way home, and arrived back at his fortress of Brú Boyne thinking he had been gone for only a few hours. But for everyone else, for Bone and the Dagda, 9 months had passed. 9 full months of pregnancy, labor, and birth, all compressed into what Elkmer perceived as a single day. The sun, held in magical stasis, had masked the passage of an entire gestation. It was a breathtaking deception, a manipulation of cosmic law to hide a deeply personal sin. And in that stolen time, a son was born, a boy named Angus. But the magic, as powerful as it was, could only solve one problem. It hid the child's conception, but it couldn't hide the child himself. A newborn baby could not simply appear in Elkmer's home without question. The secret was safe for now, but the evidence of it was crying in his mother's arms. And so the Dagda was faced with a second, even more terrible choice. The promise he had yet to make. He had saved his people from civil war. He had saved Bone from her husband's wrath. Now he had to save his son, and the only way to do that was to give him away. This is the brutal irony at the heart of the Dagda's story. The great father figure of his entire tribe, the Eachad Alathair, the All-Father, could not be a father to his own son. He had to erase himself from his child's life to ensure that life could continue. He arranged for the infant Angus to be taken in secret to be fostered by Midir the Proud, another powerful chieftain of the Tuatha Dé. Midir would raise the boy as his own, and no one, least of all Elkmer, would ever know his true parentage. Imagine the scene. The Dagda, a being of immense strength and authority, The one who carries the club that can kill 9 men in a single blow or restore them to life with the other, standing by as his newborn son is wrapped in blankets and carried away into the night. This is the promise that became his greatest wound, a vow of silence, a pact to be a stranger to his own flesh and blood. He had won a son, a potential heir of incredible power, but in the same breath, he had lost him. This act of sacrifice, born from an act of transgression, would define him. It carved out a space of profound grief and regret in the heart of the good God. He was the protector who had created a danger so great, he had to tear his own family apart to contain it. And all of this personal turmoil, this secret heartbreak, was unfolding in the shadow of the Fomorian threat. As he made these impossible choices, the horns of war were sounding in the distance. The enemy was gathering. His people looked to him for unwavering strength, for clear-eyed leadership, for the steadfast resolve of a king who had no doubts. And he had to give them that. He had to stand before his armies, his great cauldron at his side, his mighty club in his hand, and project an aura of absolute control, while his inner world was collapsing. He had averted one crisis only to be faced with a larger one. The Fomorians were not an inconvenience. They were an existential threat. Led by the monstrous Baler of the evil eye and the cunning breast, they were a force of chaos and oppression. They were everything the Tuatha Dé Danann, with their love of art, knowledge, and order, were not. This was not just a war for territory. It was a war for the very soul of Ireland, and the Dagda, the champion of his people, was now a compromised man. He was carrying a secret that, if revealed, could still undo everything. His focus, which should have been entirely on military strategy and bolstering the morale of his warriors, was now divided. Every time he looked at Mitter, he would be reminded of the son he couldn't claim. Every time he passed the River Boyne, he would be reminded of the love and the lie that started it all. The greatest strength of a leader is their integrity, their wholeness. And the Dagda was now fractured. This is the true measure of a mythological figure. Not just their superhuman powers, but their deeply human flaws. The Dagda's affair with Bone and the secret birth of Angus isn't just a side story. It's the core of his tragedy. It shows us that even the good God is capable of profound mistakes, of selfishness, of acts that ripple outwards with devastating consequences. It makes him relatable, not as a god, but as a father forced to make a choice that no parent should ever have to face. He saved the world, but he lost his son. And as he turned his gaze from the cradle to the battlefield, he had to bury that pain deep, harnessing his grief and his guilt, and preparing to channel it into the righteous fury the coming war would demand. The Fomorians were coming, and they would find the Allfather waiting, a little more broken and a lot more dangerous. The Fomorian yoke was not a gentle one. It was a grinding, soul-crushing weight pressed upon the neck of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Under the rule of the tyrannical King Bress, and now with the full might of the Fomorian kings Indech and Baler of the Evil Eye, the oppression became unbearable. They demanded a tribute that was not merely gold or cattle, but the very future of the Tuatha Dé. 2/3 of their corn, 2/3 of their milk, and 2/3 of their children, offered up each year at Samhain. For Dagda, this was not a political tax. It was a personal wound torn open again and again. Every child given over was a phantom of his own lost son, surmate. Every grieving parent was a mirror of his own broken heart. The Fomorians weren't just taking their resources. They were stealing their legacy, their light, their hope, one child at a time. The Allfather watched, his jaw set like granite, the fire of his grief banked into a cold, hard resolve. This would not stand. The Council of the Gods was a somber affair, a gathering of shadows in the once bright halls of Terra. They were beaten down, their divine spirits eroded by the constant humiliation. They needed more than just a plan, they needed a spark. And that spark arrived unannounced at the gates of their fortress. A young warrior, radiant and confident, claiming mastery of every art and every craft. He was a carpenter, a smith, a champion, a harpist, a poet, a historian, a sorcerer, and a physician. The gatekeeper, skeptical, sent word to King Nuada, who sat with Dagda and the other leaders. They tested the newcomer, demanding he prove his skills. He defeated their greatest chess player, Ogma, with such brilliance that he invented a new move. He outthrew their strongest stone thrower. Finally, he took up the harp and played the 3 magical strains, the strain of sorrow that made the court weep, the strain of mirth that made them laugh uncontrollably, and finally, the strain of sleep that put the entire host into a deep slumber. This was Luflam Fada, Luf of the long-arm grandson of the Fomorian tyrant Baelor on one side, and of the healing god Dien sect on the other. He was a prophecy made flesh, a bridge between two worlds destined to tear one of them down. Dagda watched the young god, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the fire, the prodigious talent, the unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. But he also saw something more. He saw a leader. He saw the future. There was no jealousy in the Allfather's heart, no resentment for this upstart who commanded the attention of the court. Dagda, the established power, the bedrock of the Tuatha Dé, recognized that his own brute strength and ancient wisdom were not enough. They needed this new brilliant light. He rose, his massive frame commanding silence, and he gave his support to Luf. He understood that true leadership isn't about holding on to power, but about recognizing when to empower others for the good of all. With Dagda's backing, Luf was given command of the Tuatha Dé Danann armies. The war was no longer a desperate hope, it was a certainty. As the preparations for battle reached a fever pitch, a daring plan was hatched. They needed intelligence and they needed to buy time. Dagda himself, the great Allfather, volunteered for the most dangerous mission, to act as a spy and go to the Fomorian camp to disrupt their plans. It was a move of incredible audacity. He walked into the enemy war camp alone, a giant among his foes, his presence a challenge in itself. The Fomorians, led by Indek, were both unnerved and amused. They saw this as an opportunity not to kill him, that would be too simple, but to humiliate him, to break the spirit of the Tuatha Dé's greatest champion. They decided to mock his legendary appetite. They dug a pit in the ground, a veritable cauldron of the earth, and filled it with a monstrous porridge. 80 gallons of milk, an equal measure of flour and fat, and into this bubbling morass they threw whole goats, sheep and pigs, boiling them together into a grotesque lumpy stew. It was a meal fit for a legion, not a single man. They handed him a ladle the size of a man and told him to eat. The penalty for refusal, they sneered, was death. They expected him to fail, to be disgusted, to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Dagda looked at the steaming pit. He looked at the leering faces of the Fomorian champions, and he dipped his spoon. He was not just eating a meal, he was consuming their contempt. With every massive scoop, he devoured their mockery. He scraped the bottom of the pit, dredging up gravel and earth along with the last of the porridge, and ate that too. When he was finished, he stood, his belly swollen and distended like a great hill. He had not only met their challenge, he had surpassed it, turning their act of humiliation into a display of his own indomitable divine power. He had shown them that what they considered an impossible, spirit-breaking task was, to him, merely a light lunch. He walked away from their camp, leaving them stunned and more than a little afraid. Their best attempt to demoralize the enemy had only proven how truly formidable he was. But Dagda's preparations were not yet complete. A psychological victory was one thing. He needed to secure the favor of the forces that truly governed the battlefield, fate and prophecy. He traveled to the river Unius, and there he found her, the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, the great goddess of war, sovereignty, and destiny. She stood astride the river, one foot on either bank, washing the bloody armor and entrails of those who were doomed to die in the coming battle. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring sight. She was the fury of combat, the chooser of the slain. Any other god might have been filled with dread, but Dagda saw an ally. He approached her not with fear, but with the respect due to a fellow primordial power. They spoke, their conversation unrecorded by the myths, a private council between the father of all and the mother of slaughter. And there, by the river of prophecy, they came together. Their union was not one of simple passion. It was a sacred ritualistic joining of Earthfather and War Goddess. It was an alliance sealed in the most profound way imaginable. In that moment, Dagda bound the fate of the Tuatha Dé to the very essence of war itself. In return for their union, the Morrigan gave him what he sought, a prophecy. She promised to aid the Tuatha Dé Danann. She would sap the strength of the Fomorian king Indek, taking from him the blood of his heart and the kidneys of his valor. She foretold their victory, laying out a plan of attack, advising Dagda on where and when the Fomorian host would be most vulnerable. He left the riverbank armed with more than just his club and his cauldron. He now carried the certainty of destiny. He had met with the face of death and made her his ally. Returning to the Tuatha Dé camp, Dagda was no longer just a grieving father or a powerful warrior. He was the avatar of his people's will, fortified by the enemy's failed mockery and blessed by the goddess of war herself. He stood beside the young, brilliant Luff, the perfect fusion of ancient power and new strategy. The Fomorians were gathering on the plain of Mag Twyard, a sea of monstrous forms and brutal warriors, led by the fearsome Balor of the Evil Eye. They were confident, arrogant, and utterly unaware of the forces that had been marshaled against them. They saw an oppressed people ready to be crushed. They did not see a divine army, guided by a prophetic queen of war, led by a messianic champion, and anchored by the unbreakable will of an all-father who had turned his personal grief into the fuel for a nation's liberation. The time for spying and sabotage was over. The time for battle had come. The field of battle was chosen. Mag Twyard, the Plain of Towers, a vast, windswept expanse in the west of Ireland that was about to become the epicenter of a war for the soul of the world. On one side, the Fomorians, a legion of darkness and chaos, their ranks swollen with monstrous beings and led by the Cyclopean king, Balor of the Evil Eye. On the other, the Tuatha Dé Danann, a shining host of gods, artisans, and warriors, fighting not just for their own survival, but for the very concept of civilization itself. For light, for order, for a world where skill and art were valued over brute force and tyranny. As the two armies gathered, a palpable tension settled over the land. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation and dread. This wasn't going to be a simple clash of swords. This was a reckoning. And in the heart of the Tuatha Dé camp, the Dagda knew that victory would require more than just sharp steel and strong shields. It would require magic. It would require prophecy. It would require a blessing from the land itself. And so, on the eve of the battle, as the sun bled across the horizon, the Dagda made his way to the river Unius. He went alone. This was not a meeting for generals or kings, but for something far older. He stood at the water's edge, a place where the world of the living and the world of spirit flowed together. And there he found her, the Morrigan, the great queen. She was bathing in the river, one foot on either bank, a living bridge between two worlds. She was the goddess of war, fate, and sovereignty, and her presence was as terrifying as it was beautiful. This was no chance encounter. It was an appointment with destiny. The Dagda, the All-Father, the embodiment of order and protection, came before the Morrigan, the incarnation of the wild, chaotic, and brutal nature of war. They were two sides of the same divine coin. He saw in her not just a phantom of slaughter, but the spirit of the land they were fighting to protect. And she saw in him not just a king, but the anchor of the people, the steady hand that could guide them through the coming storm. There by the river they spoke, but their conversation was more than just words. They came together, a union of earth and sky, of order and chaos, of the protector and the fury. It was a sacred act, a magical compact that sealed the fate of the battle before it had even begun. In that moment, the Morrigan became the sworn ally of the Tuatha Dé. She promised the Dagda victory, but she gave him more than a promise. She gave him a prophecy. She told him of the Fomorian tactics, of Balor's weaknesses, and of the precise moments where the tide of battle could be turned. She became his eyes and ears, seeing the threads of fate that were invisible to all others. She then departed, promising to attack the Fomorians from the shadows, to sow terror and confusion in their ranks, to be the scream on the wind that would break their morale. The Dagda returned to camp, his spirit fortified. The alliance was sealed. The land itself was now on their side. But there was another task to be done, a mission of a different sort. While Luff, the brilliant young commander, finalized the battle plans and drilled the army, the Dagda took on a more subtle and far more dangerous role. He was to act as a spy and a saboteur, but his true purpose was to buy time. He needed to delay the Fomorian advance, to disrupt their supply lines, and to sow just enough confusion to give Luff the opening he needed. He walked into the Fomorian camp, not cloaked in shadow but openly as an emissary seeking a truce. The Fomorians, arrogant and cruel, scoffed at the idea, but they saw an opportunity. They saw the great powerful Dagda, the so-called good god, and they decided to make a game of him. They sought to humiliate him, to break him not with weapons but with mockery. They would show this god of abundance what true wasteful excess looked like. They brought him to their feasting hall, but there was no fine food, no celebration. Instead, they led him to a giant pit dug in the earth, a cauldron the size of a house. And into this pit they poured 80 gallons of milk, 80 gallons of meal, and 80 gallons of fat. Then they threw in whole carcasses of goats, sheep, and pigs, stirring it all together into a disgusting lumpy porridge. It was a grotesque parody of a feast, an insult to everything the Dagda represented. It was food made not for nourishment but for mockery. Their champions, Indek and his generals, gathered around. They looked down at the Dagda, their faces twisted in cruel smiles. "We hear you have a great appetite, Dagda," they sneered. "So we have prepared a small meal for you. Eat it. Eat it all. If you leave any, we will kill you. We wouldn't want you to go back to your people and complain of our poor hospitality." They handed him a ladle. It was so large it took 5 men to carry it. The handle was the size of a tree trunk. This was their joke. They expected him to refuse, to be shamed, or they expected him to try, and to burst from the sheer volume of the foul concoction. Either way, they would have their sport. They had trapped the All-Father, not in chains, but with his own divine nature. He was the god of plenty. To refuse a meal was anathema to him. The Dagda looked at the steaming pit. He looked at the sneering Fomorian faces, and he did not see an insult. He saw a challenge. He saw their ignorance. They thought they were mocking him with abundance, but abundance was his very essence. They were trying to drown a fish in the ocean. He took the enormous ladle. He dipped it into the porridge, bringing up a steaming mass of meat and grain. "A fine dish," he rumbled, his voice calm and steady, "if the seasoning is as good as the serving size." He put the ladle to his lips and began to eat. And he didn't stop. The Fomorians watched, their smirks slowly fading into disbelief, then into shock, and finally, into a quiet, creeping horror. He wasn't just eating. He was consuming. Ladleful after ladleful disappeared. He ate the cooked pigs, the boiled sheep, the soft grains. He devoured it all with a steady, relentless rhythm. The pit, which had seemed impossibly full, began to empty. He was not slowing down. He was not struggling. If anything, he seemed to be growing stronger, his presence more immense with every bite. When he was finished, he scraped the bottom of the pit, digging his fingers into the dirt and stones and putting them in his mouth as well, lest a single crumb of their hospitality be wasted. He had eaten it all, the entire monstrous meal. He stood up, his belly now round and swollen like a great hill. The Fomorian champions were silent, their faces pale. Their joke had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. They had tried to unman a god, and instead, he had performed a miracle of consumption right in front of them. The Dagda patted his stomach and let out a satisfied sigh. He turned to the stunned Fomorians. "My compliments to the chefs," he said, his voice echoing with power. "Now I believe I will take a nap." And with that, he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground. The Fomorians didn't dare stop him. They simply watched him go, their minds reeling. They had intended to show him their power, to break his spirit with their grotesque excess. Instead, he had consumed their offering, digested their mockery, and turned it into his own strength. He left their camp not weakened or humiliated, but full, satisfied, and more powerful than when he arrived. The psychological blow to the Fomorian leadership was devastating. They had tried to mock a god with his own power, and in doing so they had only reminded him, and themselves, of exactly who he was. The spies returned to the Tuatha Dé camp not with tales of their leader's humiliation, but with a story of his divine power. Morale surged. The All-Father had walked into the enemy's den, eaten their poison, and walked out stronger. The time for games was now truly over. The Fomorians knew it. The gods knew it. The real battle was about to begin. The battlefield of Mag Twyard was a chessboard of divine and monstrous pieces, waiting for the first move. On one side, the Tuatha Dé Danann, radiant and terrible, their armor catching the pale light of the dawning sun. They were fewer in number, but each warrior was a master of their craft, a living embodiment of a skill perfected. On the other, the Fomorians, a sprawling, chaotic mass, a tide of mismatched armor and monstrous forms, giants with single eyes, warriors with the heads of goats, a sea of raw, untamed power that had held Ireland in its grip for a generation. They were a force of nature, a storm, an earthquake, a flood, and they were led by the most terrifying of their kind. But the Tuatha Dé Danann had something new. They had hope, they had a plan, and they had a leader who could see the entire board at once. Luff of the Long Arm, his face grim and youthful, rode before the ranks. He wasn't just a king. He was a master strategist. He knew that brute force against brute force would only lead to annihilation. The Fomorians had more muscle, more bodies to throw into the meat grinder. So Luff devised a different kind of war. A war of skill, of synergy, of divine logistics. He went to his smith, Goibniu, and asked him, "What power can you bring to this fight?" And Goibniu, his arms thick as oak trees, promised that for every spear that broke, for every sword that shattered, he could forge a new one with just 3 strikes of his hammer. No matter how many weapons the Fomorians destroyed, the Tuatha Dé would never be disarmed. He went to Lukton the Right, the master carpenter, and asked, "And you?" Lukton promised that for every a new spearhead Goibniu forged, he would carve and fletch a perfect shaft for it, ready in an instant. He went to Craden the bronze worker, who promised to make the rivets for the spears, the hilts for the swords, the bosses for the shields, all as fast as they were needed. It was a divine assembly line, a magical factory of war operating right behind the front lines. The Fomorians would be fighting an army with an infinite arsenal. But what is strategy without the power to execute it? What are endless weapons without the strength to wield them? The horns blew, a sound that ripped across the plain. The Fomorian horde didn't advance, it erupted. A wave of screaming, roaring fury. A 1,000-ton hammer swung at the shield wall of the gods. The ground shook with their charge. The air filled with the stench of brine and bloodlust. The Tuatha Dé braced, shields locked, spears leveled. The impact was cataclysmic. A sound like the sky cracking in two. The line held, for a moment, but the sheer weight of the Fomorian numbers was overwhelming. Shields splintered. Spears snapped. For every Fomorian that fell, 2 more clambered over its corpse to take its place. The divine assembly line was working, new weapons flowing to the front, but the warriors wielding them were tiring, being pushed back inch by bloody inch. The Fomorian champions, hulking brutes draped in the skins of sea monsters, began to smash holes in the Tuatha Dé line. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep into the hearts of the gods. And then from the center of the line came a sound that was not a war horn or a battle cry. It was a deep, resonant laugh. Dagda stepped forward. He wasn't wearing the shining, intricate armor of the other gods. He was clad in a simple tunic, his massive bearded face split by a grin of pure, unadulterated joy. He looked less like a god of war and more like a farmer who was thrilled to be putting his back into some hard labor. In his hands he dragged his weapon, the Lorgmore, the great club. It wasn't a sword or a spear, instruments of elegant, precise killing. It was a cudgel so massive it had to be mounted on a wheeled axle just for him to move it from place to place. It was a crude, brutal, horrifyingly effective tool of destruction. The legend said one end of it could kill 9 men with a single blow, their bones turned to dust inside their skin. But the other, smoother end could bring those same 9 men back to life, whole and hale. It was a weapon of absolute finality and absolute renewal. And today Dagda was only using one end. He hefted the Lorgmore onto his shoulder, the wheeled axle creaking under the strain. He took a step, and the ground seemed to compress beneath his feet. He took another. The Fomorians in front of him, who had been roaring in triumph a moment before, suddenly fell silent. They had heard tales of this god, this club. They saw the look in his eyes, a look of paternal fury, the anger of a father seeing his children threatened. Dagda didn't charge. He strode. He walked into the thickest part of the Fomorian horde like a man wading into a field of wheat. He swung the Lorgmore. The first swing was almost lazy, a practice arc. But where it connected, reality broke. The club didn't just crush the Fomorians it touched. The shockwave pulverized a dozen more behind them. It didn't make the sound of breaking bone. It made the sound of a landslide. He swung again. A great sweeping blow that cleared a space 50 feet wide. Bodies were not thrown. They were erased, turned into a red mist. He was a force of nature unto himself, an earthquake in the form of a man. The Fomorians, who thrived on chaos and fear, were suddenly faced with a power so absolute, so overwhelming, that their rage curdled into terror. They broke against him like water against a cliff. And as Dagda carved a path through the enemy, a shadow fell over the battlefield. A trio of crows circled overhead, their cries like scraping iron. The Morrigan had arrived. She flew over the heads of the Tuatha Dé, her voice a shriek of prophecy and power, screaming words of encouragement to her people, filling their hearts with the cold fire of battle madness. Then she turned her gaze and her voice on the Fomorians. She screamed spells of confusion and terror into their ranks, making them see phantoms in the shadows, making them mistake their own allies for enemies. Their chaotic charge became a panicked mob. Dagda and the Morrigan, the All-Father and the Phantom Queen, the great Earth God and the Goddess of Fate, worked in perfect, terrifying harmony. He was the raw physical power, the unstoppable maul. She was the psychological weapon, the voice that shattered morale and broke the will to fight. He smashed their bodies, she unraveled their minds. The Tuatha Dé Danann saw this. They saw their father god wading into the enemy with a laugh on his lips, clearing a path for them. They heard the battle hymn of their war goddess in the sky. Their exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of divine energy. They roared, a single unified voice, and charged into the gaps Dagda had created. The tide of the battle, which had been threatening to drown them, had not just been stopped, it was being pushed back. The Fomorian line buckled. Then it broke. Entire sections of their army turned and fled from the laughing god with the mountain-crushing club. For the first time in a century, the Fomorians were in retreat. Victory seemed for a breathtaking moment to be within reach. But this was only the first wave. The Fomorian champions had been bloodied, their fodder scattered. But their greatest and most terrible weapons had yet to be deployed. Across the field, standing amidst his personal guard of giants, the Fomorian king Indek watched the Dagda's rampage. And beside him, a figure stood cloaked and silent, a being whose very presence seemed to drain the light and warmth from the air. The Tuatha Dé had won the opening salvo, but Baylor of the Evil Eye had not yet opened his. The air crackled, thick with a sudden unnatural cold. The cheers of the Tuatha Dé died in their throats, replaced by the ragged sound of their own breathing. The Dagda's club, still dripping with the ichor of his enemies, felt heavy in his hand. The triumphant warmth of his rage was being leached away, drawn out by the silent, hooded figure standing beside Bress on the Fomorian ridge. Balaam. The name was a whisper of dread that slithered through the ranks. This wasn't just another Fomorian brute. This was a force of nature, a living embodiment of annihilation. Every warrior on that field, from the newest recruit to the Dagda himself, knew the stories. They knew that beneath that hood was an eye that had never seen the sun, an eye that had only ever opened to end worlds. The Fomorians, who had been on the verge of a full-scale rout, began to reform their lines. Their fear was replaced by a grim, chilling confidence. They weren't fighting for Bress anymore. They were fighting under the shadow of their ultimate weapon. The Dagda watched them, his jaw tight. He had shattered their vanguard, but he hadn't broken their spirit, because their spirit wasn't in their warriors. It was in the silent promise of that single unopened eye. He felt a presence at his side, not of flesh and blood, but of shadow and prophecy. It was the Morrigan. She wasn't there in her beautiful form that had seduced him by the river. This was the Phantom Queen, the washer at the ford. Her voice was not for his ears, but for his soul, a chilling premonition of the blood that was about to be spilled. She showed him a vision, not of victory but of cost, of God's falling, of the very soil of Ireland being salted with the dust of his people. The price of this day would be a wound that would never truly heal. But in the vision's closing moments, she showed him a flicker of light, a spear of impossible brightness, and the path to survival. It was not a guarantee, it was a chance, and it was all they had. The Dagda's resolve hardened into granite. He turned to his people, his voice booming across the silent battlefield, a clap of thunder that broke the Fomorian spell. He didn't speak of glory or riches. He spoke of their children. He spoke of the music and the poetry and the knowledge they had brought to this land. He spoke of the green hills and the clear rivers that the Fomorians sought to enslave and corrupt. He held aloft his great club, the Lorg Mor, and it was not just a weapon of death. It was a symbol of their right to exist. He then lifted his harp, Euthan, and struck a single resonant chord. It was the music of sorrow, the Galtry, and it washed over his own army. They wept, not in fear, but for all they stood to lose. They let go of their individual dread and found a collective grief, a shared love for their world. Then he struck another chord, the music of joy, the Giantry. Laughter, clear and defiant, rang out across the plain. It was the laughter of a people who remembered what it was to live, to love, to create. It was an insult to the grim, joyless tyranny of the Fomorians. Finally, he struck the third chord. The music of sleep, the Suintry. The Fomorian front lines wavered, their weapon arms growing heavy, their minds clouded with a sudden, irresistible lethargy. It was the opening they needed. For the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Dagda roared, and the charge was a wave of pent-up fury and desperate hope. The Battle of Mag Tuired began in earnest. It was not a battle of tactics and formations. It was a maelstrom of divine power, a chaotic clash of gods and monsters. Luff was not yet there, still rallying other forces, and Nuada, with his silver arm, fought with calculated precision. But the heart of the battle, the raging, roaring center of the storm, was the Dagda. He was everywhere at once. His club was a blur, turning Fomorian champions to pulp and bone dust. He was a living bulwark, his massive frame absorbing blows that would have shattered a hillside. But he was more than a brute. He was the good god, and he fought to protect. He shielded Bridget as she unleashed her cleansing flames. He cleared a path for Diensek's son Mayak to reach the wounded, his very presence a rallying point that turned fleeing warriors back into the fray. From the Fomorian host, a new challenger emerged, a being nearly the Dagda's equal in size and fury. It was Indek, son of the goddess Damnu, a king among the Fomorians whose mace was said to be carved from the heart of a fallen star. He bellowed a challenge, his voice like rock grinding on rock, and the battle seemed to pause around them as the two titans met. Indek swung his star mace, and the Dagda met it with his oak club. The impact sent a shockwave that flattened warriors for 100 yards in every direction. The ground itself cracked and split beneath them. Indek was strong, impossibly so, but the Dagda was more. He was the earth itself. He was the strength of the oak and the endurance of the stone. For every crushing blow Indek landed, the Dagda absorbed it, his feet seeming to grow roots into the soil. He fought with a wisdom Indek could not comprehend. He used the Fomorians' own momentum against him, turning a wild swing into an opportunity, stepping inside the arc of the mace and bringing the Lord Moor down not on Indek's head, but on his weapon arm. There was a sickening crunch of bone and sinew, and the star mace fell to the blood-soaked earth. Indek roared in pain and disbelief, but he had no time for a second breath. The Dagda's club rose and fell one last time, a final definitive judgment. The Fomorian king was no more. A collective gasp went through the Fomorian ranks. They had seen their greatest physical champion, second only to Balor, utterly dismantled. Their morale, so recently bolstered, began to shatter like glass. The Tuatha Dé surged forward, sensing the tide had turned. They were winning. They were actually winning. On the ridge, Breast the Beautiful watched his army begin to crumble, his face a mask of pale terror. He turned to the silent, hooded figure beside him. "Now!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "You must do it now, or all is lost." The cloaked figure Balor did not move. He did not even seem to breathe. But four massive Fomorian attendants, their faces grim and set, moved to his side. They carried thick, polished iron hooks. They reached up, their hands trembling slightly, and took hold of the heavy, drooping flesh of Balor's eyelid. The skin was pale and veined, like a shroud woven from diseased tissue. The air grew colder still. A silence fell over the entire battlefield, a profound and terrifying hush that swallowed all sound. The Tuatha Dé stopped their charge, their faces turning from triumph to dawning horror. They knew what was coming. The Dagda, his chest heaving, his club dripping with the gore of a dead king, looked up at the ridge, and his heart, for the first time that day, felt the cold touch of true fear. Slowly, groaning under the strain, the four attendants began to lift the lid of Balor's eye. The air itself seemed to curdle. The groans of the Fomorian attendants were lost in a sudden, deafening silence that fell over the battlefield, a silence more terrifying than any war cry. A sliver of crimson light, thin as a razor's edge, appeared beneath the slowly rising eyelid. It didn't shine, it seeped like blood from a wound. The very grass at Balor's feet began to blacken and wither, turning to greasy ash. Stones cracked. The air grew thin and tasted of sulfur and ozone. This wasn't magic as the Tuatha Dé Danann knew it, the intricate weaving of energies, the songs of power. This was an anti-creation, a force of pure, unmaking void. The Dagda felt the strength drain from his arms. The victory over Indek, the raw primal power he had just unleashed, felt like a child's tantrum in the face of this cosmic horror. He saw his warriors, the bravest of the Tuatha Dé, men and women who had faced down monsters and laughed at death, now frozen in place. Their faces were masks of primal terror, their eyes locked on that growing sliver of death. Some dropped their weapons, their hands trembling too violently to hold them. Others simply fell to their knees, all courage, all hope, scoured from them by that toxic gaze. The lid was halfway up now. A beam of sickening red light, no wider than a man's arm, lanced out and struck a company of Nuada's finest warriors. There was no scream. There was no fire. They simply ceased to be. One moment they were 100 living, breathing soldiers. The next, a patch of scorched, sterile earth from which not even a ghost could rise. The Fomorian army, shielded behind their king, let out a guttural cheer, a sound of pure, hateful glee. They knew, as the Dagda knew, that the battle was over. It was no longer a fight, it was an execution. The Dagda roared, a sound of pure defiance against the inevitable. He raised his blood-soaked club, not to attack, but as a standard, a final rallying point. "To me!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain. "Stand with me. Do not give him your fear." But his words were swallowed by the growing dread. He could feel the power of the eye pulling at him, not just at his body, but at his very essence, tugging at the threads of his divinity, seeking to unravel him. He was the All-Father, the good God, but in the face of that gaze, he was just matter waiting to be unmade. And then through the despair a light. It wasn't the sun which had hidden its face. It was a figure, moving with impossible speed from the rear of the Tuatha Dé lines. He was a blur of gold and white, weaving through the petrified soldiers like a living sunbeam. He held no massive club or broad shield. He carried only a sling, a simple hunter's weapon, and a fierce, unblinking focus. It was Luff Lamfada, the Ildanak master of all arts. He didn't run like a warrior charging into the fray. He moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the deadly purpose of a striking falcon. The Dagda watched, his heart a hammer in his chest, as the young man, his own descendant, the hope of their people, strode past him, his eyes never leaving the monstrous, opening eye on the ridge. He was the prophecy, the half-blood hero, born to be the Fomorians' doom. But he looked so young, so slight against the colossal form of Balor. Luff came to a stop just beyond the front lines, placing himself directly in the path of that annihilating gaze. The Fomorian cheers faltered, replaced by a confused murmur. Who was this? This boy, challenging the inevitable? Balor himself, his one great eye now 3/4 open, focused on the lone figure. His voice was the grinding of continents, a sound that shook the bones. Who dares to face my gaze? Turn back, little spark, before you are extinguished. Luff's voice, by contrast, was clear and sharp as a silver bell, and it carried across the entire field. I am the one who will cast your shadow from this land. Balor of the baleful eye. I am the long-handed artisan of your demise. Grandfather. The word hung in the air. Grandfather. Acknowledging the twisted bloodline that connected them, Balor let out a rumbling, terrible laugh. The get of my foolish daughter. They told me of the prophecy, that my own grandson would slay me. A fool's tale. You will die as all your kin have died. Attendants, open my eye fully. Let me see the color of my grandson's courage as it boils away. The 4 Fomorian giants gave a final, mighty heave. The leathery lid, thick as a castle gate, pulled back completely. The eye was revealed. It was not an eye as mortals know it. It was a swirling vortex of red and black energy, a pit of liquid night that promised utter oblivion. The full force of its power began to pour down the hillside, a wave of pure entropy. The ground before Luff dissolved into a smoking, glassy plain. The Dagda wanted to scream, to charge, to do something. But he was frozen, not by fear for himself, but by the terrifying pride and love for the boy standing on the precipice of doom. He had brought them this far with brute strength and earthy power, but this was a different kind of war. This was a battle of destiny, of light against the void. But Luff did not flinch. He did not run. In the instant the eye opened fully, before its gaze could truly fix upon him, he was already in motion. He had a stone in his sling, a simple river stone, but as he began to whirl it, it blazed with an inner light. He was the master of all arts. and that included the art of the sling. He spun it once, twice, the stone becoming a searing comet, a miniature sun, humming with a power that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. "Let this be your sight, Balor," Luff cried out. On the third rotation he released the stone. It did not fly. It teleported. It crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat. A streak of pure white light aimed directly at the center of that terrible red vortex. There was a sound like a thunderclap, and a wet, sickening crunch rolled into one. The stone struck true. For a moment nothing happened. Balor stood silent, his vast eyes staring. Then a shriek of agony tore from his throat. A sound so inhuman and full of pain that it made the bravest warriors clap their hands over their ears. The great eye bulged, the red light flickering and spasming. The stone had not bounced off. It had driven into the eye, and with the force of Luff's divine power, it did not stop. The back of Balor's massive head exploded in a shower of gore, bone, and foul energy. The entire eye, with Luff's slingstone embedded in it like a seed of light, was driven clean through his skull. It flew through the air in a ghastly arc, trailing ichor and brain matter, and landed with a wet, heavy thud, right in the center of the Fomorian legions. And it was still open. The gaze, which had been meant for the Tuatha Dé Danann, now fell upon Balor's own army. 27 Fomorian chieftains and 3 ranks of their most elite warriors were caught in its dying, hateful glare. They vanished. Not burned, not slain, but utterly erased from existence, their places taken by smoking craters in the earth. Chaos erupted. The Fomorians, who moments before had been cheering their inevitable victory, now screamed in terror and agony as their own ultimate weapons scoured them from the world. Their lines shattered. Their discipline evaporated. They turned on each other, they fled. They clawed their way over their own dead to escape the gaze of their fallen king. The spell of terror over the Tuatha Dé Danann was broken. A moment of stunned silence was followed by a single unified roar of triumph. And leading that roar was the Dagda. The exhaustion was gone, burned away by a surge of savage joy and relief. He saw the Fomorian ranks in disarray. Their god-king dead, their spirit broken. He hefted his great club, the wood feeling light as a feather in his hands. Luff had won the battle. Now the Dagda would end the war. With a bellow that shook the standing stones, he charged. He was no longer a desperate defender holding the line. He was an avalanche of righteous fury, the personification of his people's will to live. He crashed into the panicked Fomorian lines like a tidal wave, his club a blur of motion. The rough end crushed skulls and shattered shields. The smooth end healed the wounded among his own warriors as he passed, mending bone and flesh with a touch. He was death and life in one, the good god unleashed, and as his warriors surged forward behind him, the green fields of Mag Tuatha ran red with the final bloody price of Ireland's freedom. The Fomorian lines, which had seemed an unbreakable wall of shadow and scale, now crumbled before him. Where Luff was a spear of light, a singular piercing point of brilliance, the Dagda was a landslide. He was the raw, unstoppable force of the earth itself rising up in fury. His great club, the Coir Anman, rose and fell, not with the finesse of a swordsman, but with the brutal rhythmic certainty of a mountain collapsing. Each swing didn't just kill, it unmade. Balor of the Baleful Eye, the great terror of the Fomorians, had already fallen to Luff's slingstone, his single eye a blasted crater. But the Fomorian host was vast, their rage and despair making them fight like cornered beasts. It was the Dagda who broke their spirit. He waded into the thickest fighting, a whirlwind of splintered oak and shattered bone. He was no longer the bumbling figure of his earlier journey, but the Eachade Alathair, the All-Father, in his most terrible aspect. He was the protector of his people, and he would grind their enemies into the very soil of the land they sought to enslave. He sought out Indek, one of the Fomorian kings, and the two titans clashed. But Indeka's strength was born of tyranny. The Dagda's was born of the land itself. The battle was short and cataclysmic. The Fomorian king was obliterated, his essence scattered to the winds. Seeing their king destroyed, the Fomorian army finally broke. The disciplined retreat turned into a panicked rout. They fled for the coast, for the cold gray seas that had spawned them, but the Tuatha Dé Danann were relentless. They hunted them down, ensuring that the Fomorian threat would be extinguished from Ireland's shores for good. The victory was total, absolute. The soil of Mag Tuatha was soaked with the blood of gods and monsters. a final terrible sacrament consecrating the Tuatha Dé Danann as the undisputed masters of the island. In the aftermath, amidst the ruin and the celebration, the victors rounded up the Fomorian survivors. Among them was Bress, the beautiful disgraced former king whose greed and incompetence had started this whole bloody affair. Luff, now the undisputed High King, his face hard and unforgiving, ordered Bress to be put to death. There was to be no mercy for the tyrant who had forced their people to count every cake and measure every joy. But as the executioner approached, Bress made a desperate plea. "Spare my life," he begged Luff, "and I will guarantee that the cows of Ireland will always be in milk." Luff, a warrior and a king of light, was unimpressed. He conferred with his druids, who wisely pointed out that Bress had no power over the cows themselves, only over their lifespan. He could not make them give milk forever. Luff turned back to Bress, his spear in hand. "Your life is forfeit." Bress, seeing his end was near, tried again. "Spare me," he pleaded, "and the men of Ireland shall reap a harvest every quarter." Again Luff consulted his wisest counselors. They considered this, but concluded that one harvest a year was the natural order, for would exhaust the land and its people, a life of constant toil with no time for art or music or rest. It was another empty promise. The sentence would stand. It was then that the Dagda stepped forward. He had been listening, his expression unreadable. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also a builder, a farmer, a god of the earth's bounty. He saw past the immediate need for vengeance to the long-term needs of his people. He looked at the trembling Bress and spoke, his voice a low rumble that commanded the attention of all. "Ask him one more thing," the Dagda said to Luff. "Ask him how we shall plow. Ask him how we shall sow. And ask him how we shall reap." Luff, respecting the wisdom of the All-Father, put these questions to Bress. And here Bress could not lie or offer false bargains. These were secrets of the land, fundamental knowledge he possessed through his Fomorian heritage. In exchange for his life, Bress revealed the sacred rhythm of agriculture. He told them the proper days to plow the fields, the right time to sow the seed, and the perfect moment to swing the scythe and bring in the harvest. He taught them to work with the land, not against it. The Dagda had secured a prize far greater than the death of one disgraced king. He had secured the future of Ireland. Vengeance was a fleeting satisfaction, but this knowledge, this sacred contract with the soil, would feed his people for all the generations to come. It was an act of profound wisdom, a perfect demonstration of why he was called the good God. He didn't just provide. He enabled his people to provide for themselves. With the Fomorians vanquished and the secrets of prosperity secured, a great quiet fell over the land. It was in this quiet that the Morrigan, the great queen, the phantom goddess of fate and war, appeared. She stood upon the blood-soaked battlefield and delivered two prophecies. First, she proclaimed the victory to the land itself, to the royal mountains and winding rivers of Ireland, chanting of the peace that had been won, a peace that would last for ages. But then her tone shifted. Her second prophecy was a dark mirror to the first. She spoke of the end of this world, a future she could see but would not love, a time when courage would fail, when oaths would be broken for trifles, and evil would become the common law. A time of winter with no spring, of summer with no warmth, of seas with no fish and trees with no fruit. She foretold the slow, creeping twilight of the gods, the fading of their magic and the unraveling of the world they had just fought so desperately to create. For now, though that dark future was a distant shadow, the Dagda took up the high kingship of Ireland. He ruled for 80 years, and it was a golden age unlike any that had come before or would ever come again. Under his reign the land flourished. The knowledge won from Bress ensured the harvests were always plentiful. The weather was always mild. The rivers teemed with salmon, and the forests were heavy with nuts and fruit. There was no famine, no plague, no injustice. The Dagda's great harp, Youth, which had been recovered from the fleeing Fomorians, was now used not for war, but for peace. He would play its 3 strains to order the world around him. He played the strain of sleep to soothe the land into the gentle slumber of winter. He played the strain of sorrow to call forth the life-giving rains of spring. And he played the strain of mirth to bring forth the glorious, sun-drenched abundance of summer and autumn. The seasons turned in perfect, harmonious order at the command of his music. Ireland was a paradise, a perfect reflection of its benevolent Father King. He was the center of their world, the provider of all good things, the shield that protected them, and the heart that gave them life. The Tuatha Dé Danann lived in a state of grace, their society a pinnacle of art, magic, and culture. But the Morrigan's prophecy lingered, a cold whisper on the warm summer wind. The 80 years of the Dagda's rule, a lifetime of peace and plenty, eventually came to an end. He had built a perfect world for his children, but even a perfect world cannot last forever. The gears of fate were turning. New powers were stirring in the world. Far across the sea, a new people, mortals, iron in their hands and a new faith in their hearts, were beginning to look towards the emerald shores of the Island of Destiny. The age of myth was drawing to a close, and the great All-Father, the good God, would soon face his final greatest challenge, the unstoppable march of time itself. The ships that broke the horizon were different. They were not the strange, shadowy vessels of the Fomorians, nor the gleaming craft of the Tuatha Dé Danann returning from some distant shore. These were ships of men. Men of Mill, the Milesians, driven by a prophecy and a fierce, unyielding belief in their own destiny. They saw not a land of gods but a land of promise, a home, and they intended to claim it. This was not a war like the one at Mag Twyard. There was no monstrous Balor to be slain, no grand battlefield upon which two magical armies would collide. This was something subtler, more insidious. It was a challenge not to the Dagda's club, but to his very essence. The Milesians brought with them their own poets, their own druids, their own vision for the world. Their chief poet, Amergin Gluangel, stood upon the shore and did not issue a challenge of arms. He sang. He sang a song of power, a claim of sovereignty that rooted itself deep in the soil of Ireland. He sang, "I am the wind upon the sea, I am the ocean wave, I am the sound of the deep." In that moment he wasn't just speaking poetry. He was weaving a new reality, a new magic that the Tuatha Dé Danann had never before encountered. The gods were stunned. Their magic, which could raise storms and shroud the island in mist, flickered against the raw, unshakable certainty of these mortals. The Tuatha Dé Danann fought, of course. The three queens of Ireland, Eriu, Bamba and Fadla, met the invaders and asked that the island be named for them, a final desperate plea for remembrance. But the tide of humanity was relentless. The age of men was not coming. It was already here, crashing upon their shores. And at the center of it all stood the Dagda, the All-Father, the king who had led his people to their greatest victory, who had ruled for 80 years with wisdom and generosity. What was he to do? He could have unleashed the full, terrible power of his club, the Lorg Mor. He could have shattered their ships, leveled their armies, and turned the coast into a wasteland. He could have fought until the last of his divine children fell, a glorious, tragic end worthy of a saga. But the Dagda was more than a king. He was a father. And a father's first duty is not to his crown, but to his children. He saw the truth with the clarity that only long, weary years can bring. This was not a war they could win because it wasn't a war for land anymore. It was a war for belief. The world was changing. The faith that gave the gods their power was being replaced by a new story, the story of humanity. To fight a final bloody war would be an act of pride, not protection. It would be a king's folly, not a father's love. And so the good God made the hardest choice of his long life. He chose survival over sovereignty. He chose to trade a kingdom for a people. A parley was called. The Dagda, the great and mighty Eachad Alathair, met with the mortal invaders. And there a treaty was struck, the most fantastic treaty in the history of the world. The Tuatha Dé Danann would not be destroyed. They would not be driven into the sea. Instead, they would cede the world above, the world of sunlight and seasons, to the sons of Mill. In return, they would take for themselves the world below. The hollow hills, the ancient mounds, the Sidhi. They would retreat into the otherworld, a realm existing alongside the mortal one, forever hidden from human eyes. They did not vanish. They simply changed. They stepped sideways out of history and back into myth, becoming the Sidhi, the people of the mounds. The gods of Ireland became its fairies, its hidden folk, their power no less real, only less visible. And who would preside over this great retreat? Who would ensure this transition was orderly and fair? The Dagda. His final act as High King was not one of war, but of administration. He, who had once mapped out the Great Plains of Ireland, now assigned the Sidhi mounds to the remaining gods and nobles of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He gave Brú na Bóinne, the great mound on the river Boyne, to his son Angus Ogi. He gave other strongholds to Luff, to Ogma, to Manannan Mac Lyre, ensuring each of his people had a home in this strange new existence. He was the father, making sure his family was safe and settled, even as their entire world was turned upside down. With his people secure, with the future of the Tuatha Dé Danann preserved, the Dagda's long reign was finally at its end. His great work was done, and the wound he had received all those years ago at the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, the wound from the Fomorian Sethlin that had never truly healed, began to ache with a final profound weariness. The myths say that after dividing the Sidhe, the Dagda at last succumbed to that ancient injury. He didn't fall in a blaze of glory on a battlefield. He didn't fade into nothingness. He simply died, like a mortal man. He lay down in his own great hall within the earth, his work complete, his people safe, and the All-Father could finally rest. But did he truly leave? The Dagda was not just a person, he was a principle. The principle of abundance, of protection, of fatherly wisdom. And that principle never left Ireland. His cauldron of plenty, the Undri, may be hidden, but its spirit lives on in the legendary Irish hospitality, in the belief that there is always enough to share. His harp, Euthan, may be silent, but its music echoes in every story told by a fireside, in every song that captures the joy, sorrow, and peace of life. His club, the Lorg Mór, which could give life as easily as it took it, is a symbol of the ultimate responsibility of power, that true strength isn't just about the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to create and preserve. The Dagda is the archetype of the good god, not because he was perfect, his flaws, his desires, his rages were as epic as his virtues, but because when the ultimate choice came, he chose his people over his power. He was the father figure who understood that the greatest legacy isn't an empire that lasts 1,000 years, but a family that endures forever. He is the chieftain of the gods who became the ancestor of the land itself. His spirit is in the fertile soil, in the rolling green hills, in the ancient stone mounds that still mark the landscape like sleeping giants. The age of myth may have ended, but the presence of the Dagda, the good god, the great all-father of the Tuatha Dé Danann, has never truly faded away. It's just waiting beneath the surface of the world, a deep and resonant note from a harp played long ago, a promise of abundance and protection, for anyone who still has the magic to listen.